Hello everyone and welcome to episode 58 of Our Mind on Music. This is season 3, episode 5. In this episode I'll be speaking with Phil Yale of Phil's Tracks for our 4th collaborative effort. This time we're speaking about the incredible studio musician group known as the Funk Brothers, who were instrumental in creating what we now know as the Motown sound. In a moment you will hear Phil introducing the episode. His introduction here is the one that he used for his version of this conversation in the Phil's Tracks podcast, available on Spotify. Just check our episode description for a link to that episode. Take it away, Phil.
This is our 4th collaborative effort. The most recent one was, we had a really interesting conversation on the songwriting hub in New York City called the Brill Building. We took a deep dive into the Jerry Goff and Carole King songbook. And the very first episode that got us connected was on the Wrecking Crew 40 hit songs by 40 different artists that studio musician groups from the Wrecking Crew played on. And somewhat relative to this one, and before I forget, what's really interesting about what you and I do is we record a session and then I edit it for Phil's Tracks. You edit it yourself for Our Mind on Music, and it's just a really cool collaboration that we have here. It was during that Wrecking Crew conversation, or was it? No, I think it was the Brill Building. You suggested we explore and celebrate the music of the Funk Brothers. Jeremy, start us off with a lowdown on the Motown Funk Brothers sound.
Nice, the lowdown on Motown. For me, this is super interesting. I love the Wrecking Crew. I love what we talked about there and the connections with the Brill Building. This is separate in that the Motown sound was made in one place initially. Motown is Detroit. And they had Hitsville USA, which was their studio, and the Funk Brothers were the house band that recorded pretty much all of the music that Motown put out from 1959 to 1972 when they moved to Los Angeles. It is incredible. Over 180 top 40 hits, over 50 number ones that these guys played on. It's amazing. Their track record, songs like My Girl and Papa Was a Rolling Stone by the Temptations, I Heard It Through the Grapevine, Baby Love by the Supremes, The Tears of a Clown, Smokey Robinson and the Miracles. These guys, Hitsville USA is a very apropos name.
Wow. Over 50 number one hits. That's more than the Wrecking Crew had. I had no idea. Really, I had no idea.
Yeah.
180 or more top 40 hits. This was a prolific group of musicians that really cranked some things up.
It's amazing to me. So I didn't realize until we were researching for this episode that the earliest recording that I could find where members of the Funk Brothers were mentioned was in 1959. In fact, there were 2 recordings in 1959. Come to Me by Marv Johnson and Money, That's What I Want by Barrett Strong. James Jamerson and Benny Benjamin. So James Jamerson is today considered an absolutely iconic bass player. He's a huge influence on lots of players. And Benny Benjamin, those 2 guys, it seems, were the first credited guys who later became known as central members of the Funk Brothers.
There are, 50 or 70 different musicians that were credited with somehow being part of this group called the Funk Brothers, but there's a core group of members that really are known as the Funk Brothers. Can you give us some of the names and any information relevant to that group of individuals?
Absolutely. And as you just said, there is a huge, extensive list of people who are somehow included with the Funk Brothers, recorded with them. So I'm going to name a couple, but I'm not leaving out people out of lack of respect for what they did. It's just too long a list to include everybody. Benny Benjamin, who I just mentioned, He went by the name Papazita, and in fact, it's he's the one credited for naming the Funk Brothers. James Jamerson, who I mentioned, is on numerous recordings for the Funk Brothers. Earl Van Dyke is a major player in this, piano and organ. He actually became recognized as the band leader for the group in 1964. Prior to that, there was someone called Choker Campbell, who was the band leader. In 64, Earl Van Dyke took over. That's the guy who played the organ on Heard It Through the Grapevine. Iconic just for that, much less the fact that he was the band leader for this incredible group. Joe Hunter on keyboards. Robert White. I'm not sure if I'm jumping ahead of myself here, Phil, but Robert White was the guitarist.
Yeah, you're good.
Yeah? He was the guy who played at the beginning of the song My Girl. Dun, 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 dun. There's that. I mean, really, it's that riff that it makes that song so recognizable. He improvised that in the studio. It's a C major chord, and he just played it note for note by note and then added in a passing note. It's very simple. So iconic, though, and he improvised that in the studio.
That's probably one of the more recognizable guitar licks of the early Motown days. And when I originally played it 27 years ago, I didn't think much about it, only that it worked. In the small confines of Studio A, myself and the rest of the musicians didn't realize what an impact we'd have on the rest of the world.
This studio was Motown Records solely. Is that correct?
Yep.
And it earned the moniker Hitsville USA. Is that correct?
I'm not sure if we can say it earned the moniker. I think Barry Gordy named it that with the aspirations of it matching what he called it. I think it was more like that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, like, for example, the Wrecking Crew, that was a group of musicians, and they recorded in multiple studios for multiple labels. The Funk Brothers recorded in primarily one studio until they moved to L.A., and it was for primarily only just one label, which is Motown Records, and all of that was under the thumb of one Barry Gordy.
Yeah.
On the very first day of Motown, Barry Gordy, who started Motown, sat us down. He said, I'm going to start my own record company. We are not just going to make black music. We're going to make music for the world. And that's what we set out to do. And we did it.
Stevie Wonder, Marvin Gaye, Mary Wells, The Temptations, The Four Tops, The Supremes.
I mean, holy cow. Genius. Whatever may be said during this episode or by anybody about whether or not the musicians were valued and paid adequately, etc., he made a ton of hits or was responsible for producing them, for marketing, all of that stuff. Holy cow. Like, just absolute genius.
Yeah, I think at some point we're going to have to do an episode on Barry Gordy. Back to the Funk Brothers. So they had the song back in 59, Money, That's What I Want. That was the song that I became familiar with because it was covered by the Beatles.
Yes. Yeah.
In one of their earlier albums. Are there any other early songs that people could that we could share with listeners that kind of illustrates the Funk Brothers? Maybe some songs that people are familiar with and maybe not aware that it was the Funk Brothers.
Absolutely. I mean, they're huge. So, actually, Come to Me by Marv Johnson. When I saw that title, I didn't really know. I couldn't sing it in my head like so many of the other songs that I'm going to mention. Money, That's What I Want, right? Barrett Strong, 1959. So I think I kind of stumbled through this list already. But Baby Love was 1964, The Supremes, right? Huge hit. James Jamerson and Richard Pistol Allen on drums, James Jamerson on bass, Earl Van Dyke on keyboard. A very early hit, 1964. My Girl, 1964. Same people with Robert White on guitar. Heard It Through the Grapevine, 1968. The Tears of the Clown, by Smokey Robinson and the Miracles, 1970. So they went from 1959 up to now we're at 1972. Papa Was a Rolling Stone by the Temptations with Bob Babbitt on bass and Eddie Bongo Brown on percussion.
Papa was a rolling stone. Wherever he laid his hat was his home. And when he died, all he left us was alone. Papa was a rolling stone, my son, yeah. Wherever he laid his hat was his home. And when he died, all he left us was alone.
Just those hits alone.
Now, I admittedly am really ignorant of the Funk Brothers, and I think I'm not alone. I mean, one of the things that came out in preparation for this episode is they really didn't receive a lot of recognition. They got no credits, as I recall, on any of the recordings. They were paid a flat fee. They didn't get any percentage of the royalties off of all those number one hits.
Yep.
There was it was slow to get some recognition. I think they were ultimately inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, I think.
Yep.
And one of the members was
James Jamerson.
was inducted individually. Yeah.
Yeah.
Why do you think it is that they're not necessarily given the recognition that they warrant?
So first of all, you're right. I mean, for myself, I found out about these guys from the documentary Standing in the Shadows of Motown, 2002, which was directed by Paul Justman. One of the things that shocked me about this was not only were these guys not properly recognized during their careers and in some cases during their lives, but at the time, 1960s, I did a little search here about what they might have been paid. Apparently, they were paid about $10 per song, which even if you adjust for inflation to today's rates and you multiply by about $10, that's $100 per song, okay? Today's rates go between $250 and $300 for the same association that they worked with, the American Federation of Recording Artists. So they were getting relatively about a half to a third of what a musician would be paid today. But there's a catch, because they were paid $10 per song, whereas the going rate at the time was between $10 and $15 per hour. And I don't think they recorded My Girl in an hour. So they were getting a low-end rate anyway, and then it was per song, not per hour. So they were really not getting paid adequately, and they wrote some of the most iconic parts of those songs.
Shortly after Earl Van Dyke died in 1992, I went out to visit Robert in Los Angeles, and we went out to eat. And wouldn't you know it, as we're about to order and the waiter's coming over, all of a sudden you hear the guitar line from My Girl come over the speaker in the restaurant. And Robert got real excited, real animated, and he said, as the waiter walked over, he said, "Hey man, you hear that? That's," and he stopped dead. And he kind of looked embarrassed, and he looked down at the menu, and he says, "I think I'll have the barbecue chicken." And then, I just ordered my thing, and the guy walked away, and I said, "Robert, you were going to tell him that was you, weren't you?" He said, he kind of looked embarrassed. He said, yeah, but he looked at me, and he said, "Look at this tired old fool. He'd never believe it." And that floored me. Because, here's a guy who played a guitar line. There's the equivalent, it's like one of the top 5 all-time guitar hooks. It's right up there with Satisfaction by the Stones and Paperback Writer or Come As You Are from Nirvana. At that point I realized, here's a guy that's lived for 30 years, this close to his dream. And yet, instead of being inside the dream looking out, he was on the outside of the dream looking in, never able to touch that dream. I knew at that point, Robert desperately needed some recognition in his lifetime.
I heard it through the grapevine. Dun, 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 dun. That's Earl Van Dyke, And his name, I don't think was on the recording.
I'm hoping, Jeremy, we're going to get into a little bit more of a deep dive into that song. I heard it through the grapevine. Yeah. Why don't I do a real quick synopsis? We're talking about a studio musician group called the Funk Brothers. Let me throw out the numbers again that Jeremy shared. Over 50 number one hits. Over 50. That's more than Elvis, the Beatles, the Rolling Stones combined, and the Beach Boys.
Wow. I didn't realize it was combined.
Just an incredible impact that they had on the early days of rock and roll and Motown. They are a studio musician group that didn't receive a lot of credit, but they got a very distinctive sound. It was 65 years ago, by the way. Hard to believe, isn't it? 65 years ago that they came out with the song that you mentioned already. That's Money, That's What I Want. It's covered by the Beatles. The Beatles also covered on the same album another song that included the Funk Brothers. You've Really Got a Hold on Me.
Great song.
By the Miracles. Shop Around. See, I wasn't familiar that Shop Around was released in the 60s. I was only familiar with it from Captain and Tennille. Motown's first million-selling record.
Wow. Yeah.
And James Jamerson and Benny Benjamin are credited to contributing to the success of that one.
Yep.
How about this one? Please, Mr. Postman.
Oh, yes, wait a minute, Mr. Postman. Wait, hey, Mr. Postman. Hey, Mr. Postman, look and see. Oh, yeah. Please, Mr. Postman.
Yeah. So, yeah, we'll see.
The Marvelettes.
Yeah. So, of course, I know now and I've known for years that it was a cover by, that the Carpenters did. But growing up, I thought that was a Carpenters song. I didn't know it was an earlier song that they were doing a cover version.
Do You Love Me by the Contours. Again, it's Funk Brothers, early 60s.
Do you love me? I can really prove. Do you love me? I'm in the groove. Do you love me? Do you love me? Now that I've been there. Watch me now. Work it out, baby. Well, you driving me crazy.
And this track really, I think, does start to showcase what would become known as the Motown sound.
Yeah.
Earlier in the episode, Jeremy, you mentioned the song I Heard It Through the Grapevine. And we've talked a little bit about the Motown sound and the Funk Brothers and their groove. You're a musician, and I'm wondering if you could share with Phil's Tracks listeners a little bit about that distinctive sound and use, if you could, the song that many of us are familiar with, which is I Heard It Through the Grapevine.
Yep. So, if you listen to the Motown version, there's a very smooth, soulful, polished Motown sound, which was a big thing for Berry Gordy and everybody who worked in that group. Paul Reiser did the orchestration. He did a string arrangement that is beautiful. And they actually worked not only with the Funk Brothers, but the Detroit Symphony Orchestra recorded on this, which was not the only time that happened with these guys. Earl Van Dyke on the organ, Johnny Griffith on electric piano, and then of course we have Richard Pistol Allen and Earl Jones on the drums, James Jamerson, monster bass player, and they just lay down this groove so that when Marvin Gaye's amazing voice comes in, it's just this smooth, again, soulful feel about it. It is tight rhythmically, sophisticated melodically. It's amazing. They have a vocal group that recorded on numerous Motown tracks as well called the Andantes.
The Andantes are one of the most important groups in Motown history. They are also the classic unsung background singers who most people have never heard of.
That core Motown sound, you could not have it without the Andantes. They were recorded far more in number than any other recording artist here. I'm not afraid to say 20,000. It may have been more.
The Andantes were used, again, on many tracks, but the fact that they come in and they're backing up, you know, when you think about that part, not much longer would you be my baby. That's the Andantes. It's smooth, it's great. Then the CCR version from their 1970 album, Cosmos Factory. It was very stripped down, and it was meant to reflect their swamp rock and blues background. They stripped down the instrumentation. They made it a lot more raw, very prominent with the guitar, and of course John Fogerty's amazing raw, gritty voice comes in. It's a very different feeling. It's a lot less polished, and it was important to CCR clearly with their 11-minute version of the song. They had extended solos in there, and they were really trying to recreate a live feeling in the studio, which was very much in vogue at the time. I do love the CCR version, but for me, when I listen to the Motown version, and it's just so well put together, that Paul Reiser arrangement, you know, as a person who does strings arrangements, I just like, okay, I'm going to go back and listen to what I can steal from that, because it's incredible.
I became introduced to the song not from Marvin Gaye, but it was CCR off the Cosmos Factory album. That was one of the albums that was part of my six-pack when I was back in a kid. I'd load up 6 different albums on top of my turntable when I'd go to bed at night. Cosmos Factory was one of those albums. Gladys Knight and the Pips also had that as a hit.
Most people know it as a Marvin Gaye song, and of course the Funk Brothers were in there, which most people don't know. But Gladys Knight's version...
Oh, 1967.
Oh,
yeah.
I bet you're wondering how I knew. Baby, 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 got some plans to make me blue. With some other girl you knew before. Between the two of us, girls, you know I love you more. It took me by surprise, I must say. When I found out yesterday, don't you know that I heard it through the
I had no idea. I know she's amazing, and the Pips are incredible, but their version of it is gospel, and it's kind of like in an interesting way, it's kind of like halfway between the CCR and Marvin Gaye in terms of it's a lot more raw, because it's that gospel, just, you know, from the soul feeling, but it's definitely not anywhere near rock or swamp or anything like that. I love that version of it.
Well, Jeremy, I got one more segment I want to include in this episode, and it really kind of has to do. It has to do about Motown in general. You know, you raved about Berry Gordy and what a genius he was, and we talked about the Funk Brothers and 50 number 1 hits and 180 or more top 40 hits. What's even more remarkable is that was accomplished because there were limitations. Motown could have been instrumentally, the Funk Brothers could have been instrumentally more well known if they didn't have some hurdles they had to cross. And if it's okay with you, I'd like to kind of talk through some of the things that came up when I was doing some research for this podcast.
Absolutely.
The first thing was some limited airplay. It's not something I really thought of, but, you know, Motown was out of Detroit, and there were Motown dedicated stations in, you know, like Chicago and New York City. But as you started to move away from those urban areas, a lot of radio stations, there wasn't any designated Motown genre radio stations back in the day, or very few. And a lot of radio stations wouldn't even play their music. Was that something that you were aware of?
Not specifically. I think it is interesting to me the irony that Barry Gordy. You asked me earlier, and I didn't really answer your question. Why do I think Barry Gordy seemed to control the lack of recognition for the Funk Brothers? I think part of it was that he wanted to make an assembly line, which is well documented. And when you think about it, like, I don't know the name of the person who sewed this shirt, right? As soon as you make that person a star, then they can start to, I don't know, ask for higher pay, or they can start to make some sort of demands, So in terms of making it an assembly line, that worked, and he put out all of those hits that we've already talked about, 180 hits. But ironically, that meant that none of these people during that time became stars. So if you're going to play a song that has the Funk Brothers on it, instead of saying the incredible Funk Brothers that we all love, 180 of their hits, it was like the one name, whether it was the Miracles or the Supremes or something. It didn't build that sort of community of musicians that could have really made it spread a lot wider, a lot less limited in the radio stations that would play it.
And even Barry Gordy, as iconic a name, they were an independent label. They didn't have a lot of money. And back in the day, if you wanted to get a hit record on the radio, you had to do some serious promotion and a lot of backdoor deals. And they didn't have the resources to do it. And candidly, there was some bias.
Yeah.
I mean, music, Motown music, it's out of Detroit. They didn't get the nominations like they would or should have for things like the Grammys. They were passed over for appearances on TV shows. That pretty easy to put the Beatles on. Not so easy to put some of the Motown artists on TV back in the day. Again, we're talking, what, 50, 60 years ago.
Yeah, there is a shocking video of, I believe it was Frankie Lyman. What was his group, the Teenagers? I think. And he had just brought out a song that had become a huge hit. And of course, people didn't know who the artist was. They just knew they loved this song. And when he walked out on stage as a young black man, the audience was surprised. They, and some of them stopped clapping. Like, I know it's 60 years ago, but to watch that now, it's like, oh, geez Louise. So there was some of that as well. Just, the fact that the Funk Brothers were, I think, all black musicians. So is that what you were referring to? Like some of the radio stations that wouldn't play them would be related to that. Yeah.
It's interesting you bring that up because in episode number 129, I talked about Sister Rosetta Tharpe, and you and I have talked about her.
Yep.
And there's a video of her playing on a TV show, and they include shots from the audience, primarily a white audience. She was black. Mm-hmm. And you could see there were a lot of people that were just basically sitting on their hands, right?
Yeah.
They just weren't quite ready to accept that.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah. It's incredible to think. And I mean, guys like this, the Funk Brothers, the music that these guys brought to us is just mind-blowing, So at the very least, later on, they were recognized. They were admitted to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and like I say, James Emerson has been listed in countless interviews and etc., saying that he was a huge influence. His sound was a huge influence.
And that's a pretty good lead in, because we're going to wrap up episode number 1 of the Funk Brothers. And episode number 2, we're going to get into the music. We're going to get into the tracks. We're going to try to touch on some of the distinctive style that Jeremy has been talking about. Make sure you go to this episode's show notes. All the links mentioned in the episode are in the show notes
Nice.
of Phil's track.
Thank you, Phil.
Thanks for joining us.